Violence in video games has been a topic of controversy and interest among the fans, and it is not something that is going to be settled anytime soon. The focus is largely on the console games in this regard, that often come with heavy-duty violence and gore. But there have been some iconic arcade shooters that set the tone as the pioneers in introducing violence to the gaming community. Back in the day, many of them slipped under the radar from the censor police, and not many games today can get away with the amount of bloodshed and violent content that these games brought. In this video, I will take you through some of the most notable arcade shooters that blurred the line between acceptable violence and a bit too much. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Chiller, 1986. This light gun arcade game was released by Exidy back in 1986, and later it was released for the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1990. The player has to take the role of an unseen torturer, whose goal is to maim, mutilate, and kill various characters in a variety of dungeon settings. Some of the NPCs can fight back, and the trick is to kill them as quickly as possible. There are 4 main levels that are called the Torture Chamber, the Rack Room, the Haunted House Hallway, and the Graveyard. The violence in this game can be morbid and hard to digest at times, and the medieval torture devices are simply diabolical. You have to find ways to activate the torture devices because simply shooting your targets dead will not be effective. The game turns into a more traditional shooting game after the first 2 levels, and you also have to kill some paranormal creatures along the way, like zombies, ghosts, and mummies. The game did not have a good run in the US because the arcade owners refused to purchase it, probably because of the content being unsuitable for the young ones. The senseless violence can be unnerving for many, and you are one of the rare ones if you know this game, because it was largely marketed to the developing nations. Guerrilla War, 1987. This game was released in Japan as Guevara, and it is basically a run-and-gun video game developed and published by SNK. The gameplay follows the adventures of 2 rebel commandos, and the reference is usually seen as the iconic duo of Che Guevara and Fidel Castro in the Japanese version. They raid a Caribbean island in order to free it from the grips of a tyrannical ruler, and they have to fight hordes of enemy soldiers and rescue hostages along the way. The game narrative is based on the exploits of Che Guevara and the defeat of the Batista regime in Cuba during the late 1950s. But since the makers feared the anti-communist sentiments in the West, they did a localization of the game's dialogue and instruction manual for North America and Europe. Even today, it remains a sought-after item for the video game collectors. Because of its unique gameplay and storyline, it was quite successful in Japan, and people became fans of the smooth gameplay and the insane amount of violence and shooting mayhem. Even the graphics were remarkably good for the times, and it became one of the most popular coin-operated arcade video games in Japan. Narc, 1988. Eugene Jarvis designed the game for Williams Electronics, and it quickly became known as one of the first ultra-violent video games. The main characters in the game are Max Force and Hitman, who receive a memo from Spencer Williams, the chairman of the narcotics opposition in Washington, D.C. They embark on Project Narc, and the mission is to get to the head of an underground drug trafficking ring, Mr. Big. You take control of the 2 characters as you wage a war against the junkies, drug dealers, and crime lords. Some enemies can be arrested after they surrender, but it is always fun to gun them down, even though there are more points for arresting than killing. The game became the target of parental criticism in the industry because the violence is simply uncontrolled at times. That being said, the gamers appreciated the smooth dynamics and enjoyable gameplay that promise such intense action. Yes, things do get repetitive at times, but isn't that almost always the case for arcade hits? It is among the first games to feature blood, and this drew a lot of criticism back then, even though it has some historical significance because of the same in today's time. Overall, it is definitely a game worth revisiting. Atomic Runner Chelnov, 1988. This is a side-scrolling shooter game that was developed and published by Data East. You take control of Chelnov, a coal miner who somehow manages to survive the malfunction and explosion of a nuclear power plant and gain superhuman abilities from the exposure to radiation. There is a secret organization that wants to make use of these powers for their own evil purposes, and Chelnov has to fight the forces of this organization in order to make the best use of his newly acquired abilities. The gameplay is masterfully simple, and you can control his movements to attack, jump, and turn around. There are 6 types of weapons available, and the power-ups along the way help in improving the attack power. I particularly admire the fact that the main character's sprite animation is so detailed and smooth, given that the game was created during the late 80s. The setting of the game of a coal miner caught up in a nuclear leak drew some controversies because many started to draw parallels to the Chernobyl disaster and saw this as a parody. However, it still remained one of the better arcade games around, and it is definitely worth a throwback. Beastbusters, 1989. This was the first 3-player light gun shooter horror game released by SNK for arcades. The year is 1999, and an unexpected incident takes place. There are reports of dead people coming back to life, and they are attacking the living. The mayor of the city where the outbreak has taken place offers a massive reward for anyone who can solve the mystery and contain the reanimated corpses on the run. This brings into the picture 3 daredevil bounty hunters, Paul Patriot, Johnny Justice, and Sammy Stately, as they take charge of the deadly city. Your task in this game is to take control of the situation and find out the cause behind this outbreak, and you mostly have to shoot your way through hordes of dead. In between stages, the cutscenes explain the events of the zombie outbreak, and the boss fights are worth remembering. The game was so popular in Japan that it became the 5th highest grossing arcade game of the year, and even in North America, the popularity was not too far behind. The violent bits involved taking out the undead army, and the shooting frenzy was always fun to experience. The game even had a sequel called Beastbusters, Second Nightmare, that was released on the Hyper Neo Geo 64 in the year 1999. Line of Fire, 1989. Line of Fire was an engaging first-person shooter developed by Sega for arcades, and the game follows the adventures of a 2-man commando unit as they attempt an escape from a terrorist facility after getting their hands on a special prototype weapon. The commandos had been tasked with getting behind enemy lines to dismantle the terrorist organization and their large arsenal of weaponry. And when they came across the special weapon, they are compelled to report the findings. The gameplay sees you face off against enemy troops, military vehicles, and the action-packed shooter never has a dull moment. The stages in the game scroll both horizontally and into the screen via a pseudo 3D effect, and the game came with a revolutionary engine that allowed the players to experience a convincing 3D landscape. The heart-stopping action throughout the gameplay was appreciated by the gamers, and equally impressive were the 3D graphics. The brilliant 2-handed machine guns and many other original ideas were unheard of during the time, and Line of Fire could be quite addictive for those who got the hang of things. Some of the levels were a bit too tough, but the true gamers never shied away from the challenges. Blood Bros, 1990. This was a fun game during the early 90s, and the story involved two blood brothers, a cowboy and an Indian, who teamed up to hunt down the most wanted outlaw in Dodge City, known as Big Bad John. Those who have played the game Cabal will find similarities in the gameplay mechanics, because this one is also developed by TAD Corporations. The task is to fend off enemy troops, and there is limitless ammunition alongside some sticks of dynamite to get the job done. Blood Brothers has a game mode where two players can play the game cooperatively, and I am a big fan of this mode. The game wasn't necessarily innovative, and even the game designer revealed that the game drew inspirations from some of the classics in the previous years. The graphics and gameplay were generally praised by the critics and the players, but the game did have some flaws as well. It wasn't the most popular game around, but the violence and shooting massacre were worth trying out. It required nerves of steel and reflexes of a cat to perfect the game, and I have spent quite a few quarters on this back in my prime. Aliens, 1990. You just cannot keep Konami out when it comes to arcade games, and this one was based on the iconic 1986 hit sci-fi horror flick Aliens. The game came with both double-player and single-player modes, and this side-scrolling shooter required the player to defend against various aliens. You could play as Ellen Ripley or Corporal Hicks, and there are several tense moments in the gameplay when you face the terrifying alien attacks. The boss enemies were difficult to put down, and of course, the Alien Queen came as the final boss in the game. The game was almost revolutionary in North America, and people were immediately drawn to this arcade classic because of the popularity of the movie. It won a silver award from the American Amusement Machine Association and went on to become one of Konami's best-selling arcade games that year. The graphics were described as brilliant, and it was easily among the goriest coin-ops since Splatterhouse. I love the fast-paced nature of the gameplay, and even today, this game is regarded as one among the finest Alien games ever, which is saying something since the game was released back in 1990. Bingo! Smash TV, 1990. This game takes place in a dystopian TV game show in a futuristic world. Here, one or two contestants are required to shoot down waves of attackers, and they can collect prizes, money, and certain power-ups along the way. The levels end with a fight against the end-of-level boss, and the difficulty level of the game can be quite intense, and not for the novices. The theme of the game was obviously borrowed from certain dystopian movies like RoboCop and The Running Man, and the goal of the player was to survive till the end while earning all the riches. It was also an interesting addition to the gameplay that a sadistic host was overseeing the show, and he showed up as the final boss. This game is known as one of the best arcade games of all time, and I find it slightly amusing because the gameplay got away with a lot of violence that would be frowned upon today. Later, it was ported to almost every home console, and it was solid entertainment for the players to sit on the couch with a buddy and embark on this violent journey. I remember the game for its difficulty and for being too long, and also, it was quite expensive for the time. Now, after all these years, I have to admit that it was worth the price and the time that I allotted to go crazy with the killing frenzy. Space Gun, 1990. This first-person shooter arcade game was released by Taito, and it came with a premise that was quite popular during the 80s and 90s through the sci-fi horror movies. The story of the game was set aboard a malfunctioning space station, and hostile alien creatures had taken over the facility. The objective was to rescue the stranded human crew members and destroy the alien creatures that got in the way. You could use a cabinet-mounted light gun to target and shoot the enemy aliens that invaded the space station, and you always had to be extra careful because sometimes the human hostages would mutate into deadly aliens as well. The violence in this game was quite remarkable, and you could shoot the limbs off the creatures that resulted in blood splatters. There were 6 or 7 levels depending on which version of the game you played, and the story was nicely explained between the levels. I love these animated cutscenes, and the arcade game also used raster graphics on a CRT monitor, which made for some enhanced visuals. It became the highest grossing game of the year in Japan, and it was also an astounding hit in the US. The similarity to Aliens was hard to miss, but I didn't mind the obvious influence because of such an engaging experience.
Lethal Enforcers.
Lethal Enforcers, 1992. This popular arcade game was released by Konami, and what was so unique about this game was that the graphics consisted entirely of digitized photographs and digitized sprites. The player has to take control of a police officer in the Chicago Police Department who gets a call from the dispatcher after a major criminal organization invades the town. Most other police officers have been killed or injured, and soon, this cop has to face his toughest challenge against hordes of criminals that come for him. The game had a different version for the Japanese arcade variant, and certain profanities were removed from the US and European versions. There were some controversies around the violence involved in the gameplay, especially because the players were allowed to shoot photorealistic representations of enemies. However, it did nothing to deter the popularity of the game, and over the years, Konami brought out a couple of sequels as well. The realistic graphics blew my mind, and I also liked the appropriately hyper music that set the tone perfectly. Lethal Enforcers was both a critical and commercial success, and it became one of the top 5 highest grossing arcade games of the year in the US. Total Carnage, 1992. This multi-directional shooter arcade game was originally developed and published by Midway in North America. Set in the fictional country of Kyrgyzstan, the player had to assume the role of Captain Carnage and Major Mayhem from the Doomsday Squad in a last-ditch effort to overthrow the dictator General Akboob and his army of mutants who were set in their goals of conquering the world. The player also had to rescue the POWs held by this evil military force along the mission. I have already spoken about the game Smash TV in this video, and Total Carnage was created by the same team who worked on this one. Thus, both the games use twin-stick shooter control schemes, even though there are some subtle differences as well. I love how this game offered a classic cartoon-style cathartic experience, and the gameplay had all the good qualities and smoothness that you could want. Even though the critics had good things to say about the game, it did not reflect in the popularity, and it never became a financial success. Total Carnage is easily among the most underrated violent arcade shooters that deserved better results. Under Fire, 1994. Under Fire takes place in a locale that is similar to Wheeling, Illinois, and we have a metropolitan city that is terrorized by a gang of criminals called the Hoppers. The problem has gone from bad to worse, and even the regular cops are unable to contain this menace. The mayor calls in a special police unit for the task, and this force is armed with submachine guns and dedicated to stop the criminal infestation. Their goal is to give the city back to its citizens, and as a player, you take control of these special police force and get into the violent gun battles. The game is similar to Konami's Lethal Enforcers in a way, and it also uses digitized photographs in the graphics. Unfortunately, Under Fire was never released for the home consoles, which was surely a loss for the gaming community. It was a big deal during the early 90s, and we all loved the typical good cops versus bad guys setting. The game and the graphics were ahead of their time, and the gameplay could be quite challenging at times. For instance, the innocents would appear without warning, and shooting them could take away a couple of health blocks. Players who were skilled enough could ace the game, and I have some fond memories of hitting it out at the arcades for this 90s classic shooter. Jurassic Park, 1994. This rail shooter arcade game was developed and released by Sega in 1994, and it was based on the 1993 film that created history in the cinematic world. The game is premised on Isla Nublar after the events of the movie, and the player has to fend off dinosaur attacks while moving in a vehicle. The good thing is that you will have infinite automatic weaponry as you come across dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus, Velociraptor, Gallimimus, Brachiosaurus, and others. There are some non-dinosaur creatures as well, and the Tyrannosaurus is the boss enemy in the game. The movie was insanely popular, and it was not surprising that the game became an instant hit. That being said, there were some glaring flaws in the violent gameplay that could not be ignored. The graphics, for instance, was outdated compared to the other arcade games of the mid-1990s. The gameplay was also considered to be somewhat mindless by many, and maybe it would have been better if it spent some more time in development. Of course, the Jeep-like arcade cabinet was effective and fun to play, and this game was worth a shot for the fans of the movie. Also, it was followed by a couple of arcade sequels that were much better. Rail Chase 2, 1994. After the success of the original Rail Chase game, a sequel was always on the cards, and Sega developed and published the perfect follow-up. The gameplay was as simple as it could get, as the whole thing was set in a coal mine cart that was racing along the set tracks through some tricky environments. The player had to shoot at just about everything that they could see, and it was a solid entertainer that came with such simplicity. Rail Chase 2 received largely positive critical response, and many called this a fusion of Jurassic Park and Virtus Cop. The gameplay was a no-nonsense, fast-paced experience that didn't have a dull moment, and the great graphics would have you mesmerized. The sound was also perfectly suited to the gameplay, and the constant bombardment of cronies to shoot at made sure that the player remained on his toes the whole time. The levels offered great diversity, and the Icelandic and jungle stages were quite imaginative and fun. I also enjoyed the graphic violence in the shootouts, which was in line with the other shooter hits during the time.
The revolution has begun! Generation X is in effect!
Revolution X, 1994. This shooting gallery video game was developed by Midway, and it had a gameplay similar to Midway's earlier game Terminator 2 Judgment Day. The story featured Aerosmith, who had been kidnapped by the oppressive New Order nation regime and their leader, Helga. The game environment had some international locales where the band members of Aerosmith were hidden, and they had to be rescued to get to the ending. Along the way, the player had to make use of a mounted gun to take down the enemy forces. The ferocity of the gameplay was quite something, and the game quickly became a critical and commercial success following its release. The settings were quite creative and spread across the Middle East, Amazon jungle, and Pacific Rim, before the final showdown took place in London with Helga as the final enemy. The sharp graphics of the game were impressive enough, and I loved how the player could choose from multiple paths and pick his own. Of course, the gameplay had the tongue-in-cheek silliness, and it was honestly a lot of fun to blaze through the levels. Zombie Raid, 1995. Zombie Raid is set in 1918 England, where a small village faces a strange increase in the number of kidnappings and grave robbing. Soon, heavily armed zombies emerge, and the police is not equipped to handle the threat. Edward Windsor, a private investigator, steps in, and after he rescues a man named Charles, they team up to infiltrate a nearby castle, which is the origin of the zombie outbreak. Their ordeal continues inside the castle, with its deadly traps and terrifying threats that await them. The game was developed by both Japanese and Americans working together, and you can see the influence in the gameplay. The high-quality sprite graphics are amazing to look at, and the gameplay is quite smooth and hassle-free. That being said, there are not too many redeeming qualities that can make Zombie Raid stand out among the several arcade shooters that it has to compete with. It was still fun to try out, but I wouldn't rate it so highly even with all the ultra-violent kills that the gameplay promised.
Die! The House of the Dead.
The House of the Dead, 1996. This was a horror-themed light gun shooter game that was developed by Sega AM1, and it was the first entry in the esteemed The House of the Dead series. The story picks up with the famous biochemist and geneticist Dr. Roy Kurian, who gets obsessed with discovering the nature of life and death. His experiments take a twisted turn, and the Kurian mansion becomes the home to such deranged experiments that result in a zombie outbreak. The player has to assume the role of Agent Thomas Rogan and G as they take on the undead army created by the evil mastermind. The game obviously targeted an adult audience, and the story and ambiance of the game were clearly inspired by popular Western horror movies. The game is seen by many as one of the pioneers that popularized the zombie genre in popular culture, along with Resident Evil. The graphic violence was next level and not common in the arcade games, and you could experience 3 different endings depending on the score rank. The creature designs, graphics, storyline, and just about everything was perfect, and it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that The House of the Dead was one of the best shooting arcade games ever created.
Metal Slug.
Metal Slug, 1996. If you were a fan of run-and-gun video games during the 90s, then Metal Slug should be a familiar name. This popular arcade was developed by Nazca Corporation, and the story was set in a futuristic world of 2028. The narrative followed the Peregrine Falcon Strike Force soldiers as they attempted to overthrow a coup by the rebel army. The game became so successful that it went on to be developed into a franchise that had multiple sequels and remakes. I loved how simple the core concept was, and yet it was so effective when it came to the gameplay. It came with an easy control scheme, and the side-scrolling shooter was an exciting prospect for the gamers. The visuals were remarkable as well, and the darker ambiance was quite catchy. The game narrative also had a sense of humor that I enjoyed, and I could not get enough of the fluid hand-drawn animation. On the downside, Metal Slug could get extremely difficult at times, and it required a lot of skill to be mastered. Sexy Parodiius, 1996. This horizontal scrolling shooter arcade game was developed by Konami, and it was the 5th installment of the Parodiius series. The story is centered around Takosuke and Pentaru, who recruit various individuals for an agency who want to achieve world peace and power. There are several missions to be completed, and then comes the twist, when Takosuke steals all the profits of the agency and runs away. You then have to chase him, and there are 2 different endings depending on how the player finishes the final level. The game courted some controversies because of the sexual content in some of the levels. Many of the bosses were women in various raunchy and erotic costumes, and the violence was also a bit too much to handle for the faint-hearted. But the game was much more than that, and I really liked all the references to other Konami titles as a fun parody. Also, it was interesting to explore the secondary missions limitations in certain levels. The controls were smooth, and there was not much wrong with the gameplay and visuals as well. All in all, I consider all my hours spent on this game to be time well spent. Carnival, 1998. The story Carnival is premised in the fictional town of Greeley Valley, where there is an urban legend that claims that if a golden token is inserted in the mouth of Umlaut, a jester's skull on top of the gravestone of a ringmaster, then his haunted carnival will rise. When a group of teenagers come across the cemetery, the protagonist of the game does the forbidden task of inserting the coin. When the haunted amusement park rises from the ground, he has to fight off hordes of zombies and other monsters in order to escape. The game was known for its extreme graphic violence and dark humor, and it was surely not meant for children. Unfortunately, we never got to see a home console release of this game, which would have done wonders to its popularity. The game was conceptualized by the same guy who came up with Narc, and I have already explored the brilliance of Narc in this video. The visuals of this game were extraordinary, and what actually bothered me was the lack of extra gameplay features. It was still one of the best in the genre, and many have rightly called it one of the most twisted video games ever created.
The House of the Dead.
House of the Dead 2, 1998. The House of the Dead 2, 1998 is a horror-themed on-rails light gun shooter and the direct sequel to the original. Players assume the roles of AMS agents James Taylor and Gary Stewart as they investigate a sudden outbreak of zombies and bioengineered monsters in an Italian city shortly after the Curian Mansion incident. The story is set a year after the first game. Agents James and Gary, joined by other AMS colleagues, are sent to track down the cause of a new zombie epidemic. Their investigation leads to the sinister Goldman, a banking mogul masterminding the outbreak and seeking to replace humanity with his monstrous Emperor creation. Along the way, the agents attempt to rescue civilians caught in the chaos, reunite with Agent G, and battle recurring villains and creatures, including a revived magician and the new final boss, Emperor. Multiple possible endings are determined by gameplay performance and choices. The graphical style was highly praised in its time for its detailed monsters, varied environments, and pronounced gore. Creature design and the rapid, intense pace were lauded, though voice acting and plot have a campy B-movie reputation. The difficulty is accessible but challenging, striking a balance that fits arcade-style play, with bonus items, unlockable content, and performance-graded multiple endings. Beastbusters Second Nightmare 1998. Beastbusters Second Nightmare 1998 is an arcade rail shooter set in 2009 where a mysterious virus outbreak at the International Specialized Pathologies Hospital, ISPH, located on New Tokyo Port Town, mutates staff, patients, and animals into bloodthirsty monsters. The epidemic quickly spreads, threatening the entire city's population. Players take on the roles of two Marine commandos sent with a mission: infiltrate the quarantined hospital and eradicate the monstrous threats before the virus can endanger all of humanity. The narrative is intentionally over the top, echoing B-movie zombie tropes and drawing clear inspiration from arcade horror shooters like The House of the Dead. There are some noticeable changes from the original, and I thought that the visuals definitely got better, as did the violence quotient. The smooth gameplay left nothing to complain about, and if you played this game as a kid, you definitely had an amazing childhood. The straightforward and effective story with the gory visuals definitely packed a punch, and I thoroughly enjoyed the horror setting of this action-packed game. Target Terror 2004. Arcade games are known for simple plots, and Target Terror keeps things without any complications. The plot is straightforward. As members of an elite counter-terrorism unit, players must thwart terrorist assaults on the Denver International Airport, the Golden Gate Bridge, and the Los Alamos nuclear facility. The final mission involves a hijacked airliner on a collision course with the White House, requiring players to fight through the plane to prevent disaster. If the players succeed, the president expresses gratitude before being abruptly kidnapped, leaving the story on a to-be-continued note. Unfortunately, a sequel never materialized. The presentation adopts a deliberately campy, low-budget style, using live-action actors for enemies and NPCs, echoing classic shooters like Area 51 and Maximum Force. This FMV animation contributes heavily to the game's infamous cheesy charm, with overacted hostage scenes and exaggerated costumes. Replay value is moderate, hinging on score chasing, medals, and discovering minigame secrets. But those seeking polished or deep gameplay may find it shallow and repetitive. Target: Terror is a frantic, self-aware throwback to 90s FMV shooters. Its outrageous violence, digitized graphics, and relentless enemy swarms create a spectacle that blends camp, challenge, and arcade nostalgia, earning both criticism and cult appreciation for its so bad it's good appeal.
Operation Wolf.
Operation Wolf, 1987. The game won the Golden Joystick Award for the Game of the Year, and it absolutely deserved it. The story required the player to take the role of Special Forces Commander Roy Adams, and you had to rescue the hostages held captive in enemy land. There were 6 stages in the game to go ahead with the story, and each stage came with different objectives and unique gameplay. One had to shoot a certain number of soldiers and vehicles to complete each level, and the action-packed violence was relentless. Operation Wolf enjoyed an overwhelming global popularity, and people went gaga over the amazing visuals given how this was during the early days of arcade shooters becoming modern. The violence came under some scrutiny and criticism, but it pleased the Gore hounds to no end. I could sit through this fast-paced action all day and enjoy the non-stop entertainment. Marvelous verdict. These games define an era of old-school goodness. If you have stayed with me for this long into the video, you probably have some emotional connect with these arcade classics. Same as I do. Yes, they wouldn't probably stand a chance against the more competent and high-end modern games. But those were different times, and the video game industry was finally getting its act together to enter into the new age technology. I have enjoyed these games for hours back in my childhood, and even today, it is fun to look back at the intriguing plots and fun gameplays that made them so special. Do let me know in the comments below what you think of these iconic games, and feel free to add a couple of others to the list that you feel deserve a mention among the violent arcade shooters. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us. If you haven't already, have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.